Now, they did not give me a big torch to ignite like they do at the Olympics, but I am pleased to kick off this journey with us together by introducing this year's visiting keynote speaker, Dr. Awneet Sivia. So Dr. Sivia comes to us today by way of the University of the Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, British Columbia, where she's the Associate Vice President for Teaching and Learning. She's been at the University of the Fraser Valley since 2011 as chair and faculty member, associate professor in the Faculty of Education, Community, and Human Development. For the past 20 years, Dr. Sivia has been working in teacher education programs at the undergraduate and graduate levels. And her current role as AVP Teaching and Learning, she works with a team of designers and specialists and facilitators, and their job is to support and promote high standards in teaching practices, in curriculum, in assessment, and multimodal instructional delivery. Dr. Sivia's research and scholarship span the areas of science teacher education, diversity leadership, social justice education, humanizing pedagogies, and leadership in online education. She leads a network of South Asian Canadian teacher educators representing 5 BC universities and is actively engaged in decolonizing and diversifying education at all levels by advocating for systemic change. I'd say she's a pretty busy person, and I'm glad that she could brave the fog and make the trek from coast to coast to be with us. Dr. Sivia believes that post-secondary education institutions, they're on the cusp of a monumental change, a shift in what we do and how we do it. We tend to think that post-secondary institutions like ours have a unique role in society as places of becoming and learning and doing and dreaming. Dr. Sivia thinks that role is being tested right now in many ways that raise questions about the impact and relevance of higher education. So given those challenges, post-secondary institutions must be responsive and innovative in preparing graduates, and they can do that by transforming what they teach, how they teach it, and why they teach what they do. So Dr. Sivia's keynote today is going to explore what innovation looks like in teaching and learning, with a focus on putting innovation into practice and how that can transform not only our classrooms, but our institutions and maybe also, hopefully, our communities. So let's get started. Welcome again, and I'm pleased to introduce our visiting keynote, Dr. Awneet Sivia, to get this year's conference underway.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, the beautiful introductions. And as I said, Dr. Rosales, I'm tired listening to all of the things that I was listed doing, but hopefully we'll be getting energized from our talk this morning. I want to begin, obviously, by acknowledging the territory that I'm on today, presenting to you. And I know that the acknowledgement was read, but while at Memorial, I do want to acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land, the diverse Indigenous peoples of this land, and the territories from which all of our campuses, all of your campuses are located. And so acknowledging that with respect, the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, Inuit, and Innu of this province. I am here from BC, but the location of this work that was done and the work that I do in my role at the university is on the traditional and sacred territory of the Stalo Tamak, of the Stalo people of the Fraser Valley. And Stalo is the people of the river. And of course, we've got many of them in BC. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm so thankful, and I'm so sorry we brought the rain, because we didn't intend to, but it sure followed us, along with the fog. And everyone's been apologizing for the fog, but you have an absolutely beautiful city. We were able to walk around yesterday and just appreciate all the colors. So in true Newfoundland fashion, I dressed up really bright with all the colors that you have in your beautiful city. So I think about land acknowledgements, and I want to talk about how I use these land acknowledgements to really inspire students to think about them differently, and not as an act that has to be done or that it becomes somehow performatory. So I just want to also acknowledge hello to everyone that's joining us online, and please do take time to acknowledge the territories where you're joining us from, and hopefully you're engaged as we move along this presentation. So I often reflect on the land acknowledgement, and I do this with my students, I do this with colleagues whenever I'm working with them. I often think, well, what does that land acknowledgement actually mean for me? Why is it important? And so for me, what I did was I looked at your beautiful landing page that talked about the land acknowledgement, gave me a little bit of history of this area, and I picked out some keywords that really resonated for me. The idea that the tradition of knowing and teaching and learning is really prevalent through this land acknowledgement. The idea that the ways of being and knowing are ones that we want to celebrate through land acknowledgement. That we want to disrupt settler colonialism and really push our understanding of what our role is as immigrant settlers, as settlers in Indigenous territory. And I really love this statement, a commitment to change, because it resonates for me with what I talk about with my students and with my colleagues. For me, a land acknowledgement is a call to action. It's a call to action to change the status quo. So today's talk is hopefully going to take us into a place of thinking about how can we put innovation into practice? And why isn't all teaching innovative? I think so. I think it's inherently innovative. And I hope that today's presentation will show us some ways of how it is. So just to back it up a little bit, I'm going to warn you right now that if I start yawning, it is 4:45 a.m. for me. Just to declare that that's the time of day it is for me. So apologies in advance if I start to look like I'm falling over. I won't. But if you start yawning, I'm in trouble. So I hope that doesn't happen for all of you. I also took time to figure out that I'm 5,032 kilometers away from home, and I'm only 3,300 kilometers from Dublin. So happy to be here, and really sad that I didn't book a flight to Dublin from here as well. So thinking about our talk this morning, and I say our because you will be involved. Some of you have some handouts. For those of you online, you have a form that you can download from the link that's provided. It's really our talk because I hope that what I'm saying lands for you and that you take time to understand and make sense of it. And so our talk today is about what is innovative teaching and what isn't it. Because as Dr. Rosales mentioned, there's times in post-secondary in education where there's all kinds of buzzwords. And right now, one of the big buzzwords is innovative teaching and innovation. So how do we unpack that and how do we understand some of the misconceptions around it? We're going to look at some of the paradoxes in higher education that kind of prevent us from going towards innovation or that are seen as barriers. I'm going to share some future trends with you, and as good innovative educators do, I've got lots of questions for you. So what if we can think about some possibilities? I'm going to share with you some influences that have significantly shaped my journey as an educator. I've been in education for over 35 years, and in all aspects of education, these 6 orientations to curriculum, teaching, learning, assessment have significantly shaped my journey. And I hope that they are insightful for you and can teach you something about how you might want to move forward in your own path and journey of innovation. We're going to look at what innovation into practice looks like. And I took a play on the words. It's really about being in practice, and it's also about innovation to practice. So let's see how we can unpack that. And of course, today is going to be some examples, and you'll see some amazing educators who have shared some innovative practices with us at our university and across the country through the 3M National Teaching Fellows that I'm part of. And then there'll be time for questions and comments. How does that sound? All right. So I always start with accessing prior knowledge. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds to pull out a phone And how many of you are familiar with Padlet? Great. So for those of you folks online, you should be able to do this from the display. If you just put your camera up to the QR code, you should end up on a screen that says Padlet with a little plus sign at the bottom. Okay, thumbs up when we're ready to go? Great. So the question is, what does innovation mean to you? Now, I don't think we'll be able to capture the ones online. Oh, these are great. There's a lot of reference to being new, and that might be one of the misconceptions that we try to dispel a little bit. Adapting, absolutely, learning and growing. Saying yes to new ideas, yes, being open to innovation is a big challenge, but so important. I'm just going to try and move that down. All right, fabulous. So I'll keep this Padlet open and we can share it with you as part of the PowerPoint. But just wanted to kind of gather some of your ideas and think about, you know, how is innovation looking for you? And one of the things that we want to make sure we do is we always want to access prior knowledge with our audience, with our students when we're teaching, and just get a sense of what they know. And it's obviously you know so much about innovation already. Let's see if we can unpack this a bit more. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so dispelling some misconceptions. So one of the things that the buzzword of innovation sometimes means for people is, oh, well, it's got to be with technology. And that's the only way to do innovation. Others will say that it's about advancement and progress, that you have to do it for the purpose of advancement and progress. And that's true for some forms of innovation, but not for all. We hear this a lot in post-secondary. Innovation means that I won't have time to teach my content. Yes, they say with a smile. But of course, we can find ways that it's embedded within the content teaching. It's another thing to do. Can't do this anymore. I've already got too much on my plate. Can't do innovation. That's just another thing to do. And so this idea of trying to dispel that is to say, how can we embed it in the day-to-day life of your work as an educator? It's something that I hear quite often with new faculty that come to the university. I get the great privilege of working with lots of new faculty, recent PhD grads, and they say, oh, but I'm not experienced enough. That's for experienced faculty to do. And I think, oh, but you're the newest people, so you should know all of those innovations. You should be the ones pushing the innovation. So that takes a little bit of convincing and empowering of young faculty or new faculty. Some people think that innovation has to be done at a quick and steady pace always. And that's not true. As we'll see, it has ebbs and flows, and it really depends on how you deal with risk and failure of trying and making those attempts. This is a really important one. Many people think that to innovate is an individual activity. I have to do it by myself in my classroom, and it's got to work for me. And we think about how important it is now to collaborate and build that sort of network of learning and professional growth. And this is something that we'll unpack through this talk, is that innovation is the same as in practice, is the same as to practice. And I'm going to position those a little bit differently for you as we go through this talk and have us think about it a little bit differently. So before we go into innovation, we have to think about, well, what is the future of higher education? So I want you to think about this. What do you think teaching will look like in 30 years? What do you think teaching in higher education will look like in 30 years? So turn to a partner, share one idea. I won't put you on the spot. All right. I have yet to find a good innovation for interrupting a good conversation. I'm very sorry. Other than putting my hand up and hoping that that gets people's attention. So for those of you online, I hope you found someone at home or in your space to have a quick chat with, maybe the cat, maybe the dog, and certainly some good conversation here. So I won't ask people to share out, but when we think about what will teaching and learning look like in higher education in 30 years, I want you to think about this. Please don't do this at home. Someone once said, if you stuck your head in the sand and pulled it out, 50 years later, 100 years later, everything around us would have changed except a school or an institution of education. So today, 50 years later, 100 years later, teaching and learning largely looks the same. We have rooms where students go to learn the same content at the same time, in the same way, at the same pace. We have designated learning places called schools and classrooms. Those are the places you go to learn. And we know that learning happens everywhere now. We still rely heavily on print and spoken word, as we're experiencing today in teaching and learning. We have disciplines and disciplinary silos that are still divided by buildings, not just even rooms, buildings. So think about that even through all of the innovations that have happened, we're still kind of the same educational model that we've been. So thinking about innovation is, I often think about it as sort of the groundswell of change. If we do it at the micro level, it can have ripple effects on the macro. And so that's what we're trying to inspire here today. So why hasn't this changed? Because I have to ask that question. Why haven't we changed? It's full of paradoxes, right? The world is full of, my life is full of paradoxes, trust me. But the world is full of paradoxes, and certainly higher education is. The latest OECD report shows that the paradoxes that exist in higher education are literally like opposing forces. And so if we think about a few of these, I won't go into every one of them, but the ones that sort of stand out for me are this idea that modernizing is in opposition to or almost counterintuitive to disrupting. Well, isn't our job to disrupt? And yet, how do we modernize or create the forward movement of education? I think about innovation and risk avoidance, right? Dr. Rosales talked about taking risks. Many of you wrote about taking risks when we think about innovation. And I think, well, innovation and risk avoidance, so you have to, be risk avoidance or you have to innovate. I think you can be both. And this last one really kind of floored me, right? This idea that education is different than learning. And the idea here, I think that they were talking about, is that there's a paradox between the idea that, well, if you teach, it doesn't mean they've learned. Have they learned? How do you know? Right? So this notion that, oh, I'm an educator, yeah, but are they learners? Have they learned in your presence and through your teaching? So I just thought these were really interesting paradoxes, and I'm a great fan of opposing forces because I kind of have always lived in a third space. And for me, the tension between those two extremes is a really, really rich place for change and for innovation. So I always think of this as a prompt. So we've had disruptors before, of course, these kinds of disruptions that happen as a result of these paradoxes. Google, graphic calculators, remember graphing calculators? Oh my goodness. People thought that was the end of mathematics. Well, here we are, still teaching mathematics, thank goodness. Wikipedia came along, that was gonna be the end of libraries. We still have libraries. And of course, generative AI has come along now, and we see that through that, thankfully, because of the human ingenuity that we have as humans, we say, okay, that's come along, let's innovate. So we're starting to see people doing really creative things because of generative AI. So these disruptors are kind of a nice sort of seed of innovation. And I've always believed that if dissonance is the mother of thought, and if we can think about that dissonance between those types of paradoxes and the disruptors that we face constantly in higher education, well, then disruption should be the seed of innovation, right? Should be the seed of innovation. All right. So you picked up some pieces of paper, and I would like to engage you in some reflective activities as we go through this. So I've given you something called window notes, and hopefully you have something to write with. I'm going to ask you to take 30 seconds to think about anything that's resonated for you, anything that has challenged your thinking, something that you found new and interesting, or a question that you have. So choose one of the squares, just one, write something down, and we'll have some fun with these at the end of the talk. So we're going to do this 4 times throughout the talk. So have the window notes handy and ready, and we'll have a chance to share out at the end. Great, thank you. So as my introduction and wonderful introducers mentioned, I am a passionate educator who believes that the role of post-secondary education really is on the brink of challenge and reform. So I think about the world, and right now the world is on fire. We have protests going on in different universities at the moment, police moving in. We have wars that are breaking out and are in process right now throughout the world. And there's a great deal of uncertainty. Those are local and global challenges because the world is in our classroom. So every challenge that seems so far away is really living in our own homes and in our own spaces. So in a world on fire, we need to think differently about how we prepare students, what that means to prepare students for the world. And so thinking about how do we prepare students, what are the future trends that post-secondary education is sort of moving towards? And this is a report, the latest report from the EDUCAUSE organization, EDUCAUSE report, that came out in 2023, and it listed 5 trends. And I thought this was quite interesting because I see us working at University of the Fraser Valley, and I'm sure here at Memorial as well, in all of these ways to support learning and to move forward. So of course, innovation in learning spaces is a huge area of growth. I currently chair a committee that is an interdisciplinary committee across the institution that looks at how do learning environments shape pedagogy, right? So we understand that there's a real architecture to pedagogy, right? Not just the architecture of the pedagogical structure of teaching, but the room arrangement. So is there ways that we can set up group tables? Should we be having whiteboards on all classroom walls? Is technology, should it be mobile? Should it be stationary? How do we untether the professor from the front of the room and get them to move into the learning space? And so these questions require us to really challenge our notions about what is a classroom and what does a school look like. So these ideas around innovating in learning spaces is important. Of course, digital connectivity. And I think the really exciting piece that's I'm always excited about, of course, is equity and accessibility. And is this growing field of research on teaching and learning. And as many of you, especially here in the Teaching and Learning Center, would be involved in scholarship of teaching and learning and CITL research, this is a really burgeoning area of research for higher education. It's been around for a long time in the K-12 field, but really growing in the higher education area. And so I'm really hopeful that we can start to actually research our practice and find out what are some of the things that we can do to change, to innovate, and why do we need to innovate in those areas? So I asked these questions. What if? What if we reframed teaching as inherently innovative because every one of our students is unique? It's because of who they are that our teaching becomes inherently innovative. What if practicing innovation in teaching was the role of faculty? What if we baked it into the job descriptions and into the outlines and the responsibilities and the policies? What if innovation didn't just imply making progress, but doing things differently and doing them better? And why are innovative teaching and teaching different? Do we need the descriptor? Can we get rid of that descriptor and think about all teaching as inherently innovative? Well, I hope we can. So how do we get there? I wanted to share with you 6 orientations that have significantly influenced my teaching over the years. And not just mine, many other educators. Some of you will be familiar with these. Many of them come from distinctly within the field of education, science education, diversity education, but they are seminal scholars in their fields. And these influences or orientations, and I like to use the word orientation because orientation implies that it gives me direction, right? That I'm pointed in a particular way. So the orientations have really shaped my pedagogy, and I think many others as well. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about these 6 orientations, share how they've connected to my practice, and then show some examples of them in practice. So orientation 1. Some of you may be familiar with William Pinar's work. He's a leading educational scholar in the area of curriculum theory, UBC professor, I think retired now. And Dr. Pinar framed back in 2004 in his book, a seminal book called What is Curriculum Theory? He talked about the autobiographical curriculum. And at the time, as a kind of PhD student, thinking about what does this mean? What does autobiographical curriculum mean? I started to dive into it and realized this was the curriculum that was missing in my own education. This was the curriculum that said who I was, my history, my lived experience, and the cultural capital that I bring to the classroom didn't matter. And what he said was, well, what if the subjects weren't history, chemistry, math, biology, but were the students who undergo them? So what he made us do, and what this orientation made me think about, is that very simple but salient shift from I teach content to I teach students. And that was a really powerful shift for me at that time, because I was seen, right? And we want our students to be seen. We want our students to see themselves in that curriculum. And so the autobiographical curriculum, he believes the lived experience is the educational experience. And he centers, the theory talks about centering curriculum on the lives of students. And so that means getting to know your students, getting to find out what kinds of interests they bring, what are their passions, what are their experiences, where have they learned what they've learned, what are they interested in, knowing all of that. And so if we believe this, then the content we teach, pardon me, in our first year right up to our 4th year courses can be seen as a vehicle through which students can learn about who they are, what they know, who they want to become, and how to attach meaning to what they learn. And that last one is the most important, because if they don't attach meaning to what they learn, they haven't learned it. It's been told to them, but they haven't learned it. Innovative teaching, then, is helping them to make those personal connections. And really, my hope is that all students, I will say that the double-edged sword of university education is not just preparing students, but preparing them to change the status quo of what is. So really, their agency and preparation, right? The second orientation, some of you will be familiar with, of course, is the work of Paulo Freire and other critical pedagogues of his time, which is the framework around the banking concept of education. So the banking concept is exactly the way it sounds. The idea that knowledge is being deposited and when it's needed, being taken out by students and put out on a test. So that's how we conceptualized education for many years. And that banking model really treated learners as consumers and promoted this notion of a transmission curriculum, that we transmit knowledge and we simply are, that's our role as educators. And he challenged this back in 1970s. He did a bunch of work with Brazilian farm workers and talked about how do we take the knowledge and the lived experience of these amazing humans who are transforming the agricultural landscape of Brazil at that time, and how are we not using that knowledge? How are we not drawing on it in our teaching? How can we empower them? And so through his work, he really kind of challenged this unautobiographical approach of not looking at his students as sources of knowledge. So from this, many decades later, Miller and Sellers took the notion of the banking concept and said, hey, how do we change the banking concept, which is this transmission model, to a more transaction and transformation model? How do we make that sort of progression from transmission to transformation? And so they gave us this really great framework. And it surprises me that many people do not know about this work. So I thought I would share it with you here. It was absolutely transformational for me because it gave me the language to talk about the way that I wanted to teach. And so I look at number 4 in particular. The teaching methods from transmission is instructor-led. And we talk about that in higher education all the time, right? Instructor-led classes. So instructor-led approaches, and the purpose is to transmit the knowledge. So kind of like what I'm doing to you right now, but we'll make it a little bit more interactive. And then transaction is, and I think a lot of faculty and a lot of higher education classes are moving in this direction or are already moving in this, or have already moved in this direction. And that is the focus on the problem solving and analytic approach. How many of you are teaching classes or in classes where you get to problem solve together and work with colleagues, right? Or work with student partners. So I think there's a lot of that transaction kind of teaching model going on. The key here is if we go back to our original premise that universities are on the cusp of either responding or retreating from the world that is, if we want to really respond, we need to move into a place of transformation. We need to move into a place where the problems that students are working on, the issues that we're bringing to the classroom as faculty are the issues that students live every day, that is prevalent in their lives, that speaks to them, that sees them. So I really like this model, and I think it's a very helpful way to help people think about, well, you want me to innovate, what do I need to change? Well, let's start changing the purpose and approach of your delivery. So this positions you from moving as a curriculum deliverer to a facilitator of learning. That's a nice way to think about how to talk about innovation, is how do we talk about this with faculty? And I often use this expression or this image with faculty that I work with, and I say, well, the idea of delivering curriculum has been a big focus of your teaching. What about moving it to facilitator of learning? You're really there to facilitate the learning that students do. They're the ones who have to learn it. You've done the work, right? All right, so let's take a little break. Do some more window notes. Anything that landed for you, resonated for you, questions that you have. And this time, maybe we'll take a couple of answers from the audience. Who would like to share something that they wrote? Thank you.
One of the things that keeps coming up in my mind is the massive disconnect between administrative structures, administration, and day-to-day realities and best pedagogical practices. In the introduction, we heard about moving away from a focus on grades, but just look at how universities work.
Yes.
Research opportunities in the summer are decided almost exclusively on grades. Getting into a professional school is decided exclusively on grades. The ability to have an honours degree, to go into an honours program and do a research project, one of the best forms of experiential learning, is exclusively decided on grades. You can literally have students who pass every single university course, and at the end they're told they're not allowed to graduate because their grades are too low. And they've never failed a course. I don't know of a single university that will even consider doing a proper task time analysis, especially with respect to teaching.
Yep.
And when you bring it up, you're left out of the room and you're told, well, if we do that, we'll not be able to offer any programs because that will require too many staff. So there's this huge disconnect that's there. And so it ends up being individual instructors trying to do things, but there's no support, there's no reinforcement at the university level.
Thank you for sharing that. So I hear exactly the same thing at my university. You have an amazing keynote speaker who's going to be speaking about ungrading and the amazing work that her and her colleagues have been doing. I think about this, I say it's not or, but and. And I use the notion of and a lot. A lot of people think that if we get rid of grades, we have to get rid of grades completely, and then we can do this other thing. It's either this or that. And I would say it's and. And what I mean by that is there's a place for grades, and there may be a place for grades that continues in certain ways. But the shift from that kind of assessment to assessment for learning is absolutely an important shift. And I would say that generally speaking, administration is behind that movement. It is the structures, and those structures have been in place forever, just like some of the things that haven't changed in 100 years. So I don't have an answer for you, but I appreciate that you've raised that as a concern. And thinking about innovation might help push that. I often think about how do we change those structures? And in my experience, the only way to change a structure is to change the work that's being done within the structure. By changing the work that's being done in the structure, it shifts the structure format. So I think maybe the innovation around ungrading and other kinds of assessment models, and you'll see some examples in today's talk, we might shift that process a little bit. I can tell you right now that from professionals, I just went through a whole process of redesigning our institutional learning outcomes, updating them. So we have 8 institutional learning outcomes. When I went and did a survey, not just myself and a committee of 40 cross-institutional people, when our review committee went through and looked at what are professions wanting, what are some of the fields of graduate programs wanting, they named so many competencies that don't show up on a test, that aren't graded. And so that made us really think about, maybe we are just creating this myth for ourselves that the grades is the only way. So maybe that's something for us to challenge. All right, well, thank you. I'm going to move on to our next 3 orientations. This is one that has helped me incredibly in my work with science educators. It is also one that has helped me immensely in my current role as an AVP teaching and learning, working with faculty in different disciplines. So Lee Shulman put together this really beautiful theory of pedagogy called signature pedagogies, and some of you may have heard about it. And what he basically argued was that every discipline has its own inherent pedagogical structure. that we don't need to look far and we don't need to borrow from other disciplines on how we teach. We actually need to look at our own disciplinary structure, our own epistemologies of our disciplines, and see how did knowledge come to be in those disciplines? And ask that really important question, how do we honor, for example, the nature of science in the way that we teach science? Because right now, I can tell you that in my university, many faculty are teaching science as textbook science. The answers. They rarely talk about or teach about what we call frontier science, the science that needs to be done to get to those answers. So there's a disconnect between how one teaches and the disciplinary structure. So it's really important to think about it within your own discipline. So I ask this question all the time now. So within your own discipline, what are some of the signature pedagogies that you'd want to see students enact that help them understand how that knowledge was arrived at? So nature of science, that's an area that's my background. So I teach that a lot with my prospective science educators. I have students that come in with degrees in chemistry and biology and physics. And I say to them, so how did you learn your science? That was the question I asked. How did you learn your science? And they say, well, the teacher taught the concepts to me. And I say, okay, well, did you practice those concepts? Were you able to enact them? And some will say, yeah, through labs, but really it was the content that came out of the textbook. And I think, well, then how do you honor the nature of science, which says that science is exploratory and full of observation and full of creativity? How did that manifest in your experience? It didn't. It didn't. So we think about what are the disciplinary structures, and Lee Shulman gave us this really beautiful notion of signature pedagogies. So I ask you, what are the signature pedagogies in your disciplinary fields? And how can you use those as a prompt to innovate your teaching, to think differently about your teaching? So nature of mathematics, right? How is mathematics? Mathematics is a beautiful, beautiful subject, right? That's how it's talked about. And yet it's taught in such a rote way that the beauty is absolutely beaten out of it. And it's such a shame because it really is a beautiful subject. And it's very collaborative. And mathematicians spend time and they sort of do this very, very slow and, focused process. And we say to students, you have 30 minutes to finish that test. So there's so many counterintuitive practices in the way that we teach that don't honor the signature pedagogies of those disciplines. So ask your folks to say, I'll ask your faculty to this question about discipline-specific pedagogies. What are the signatures of your professional field? And of course, Mary Ellen Weimer talks about this in a different way many years later in her book. And she says it's about facilitative teachers are really modeling how experts learn in their field. So if you're teaching a content area and you model the way that you would learn as an expert in that field, that's powerful for students. It's so powerful. All right, so orientation number 4 is something that I referenced in my description of the talk, which is Stephen Brookfield's 4 Lenses of Knowing. And these were very helpful, and I think many of us are understanding the importance of this now. How do we learn about teaching from our students? How do we learn about teaching from our colleagues? How do we learn from teaching about research on teaching? And how do we improve our practice by doing some personal self-reflection? And he talked about these 4 lenses as being absolutely crucial to become critically reflective teachers. How to become critically reflective educators, we need to use those 4 lenses in our work. And what's great about this is I've seen this really take hold in the post-secondary environment over the last 20 years, 20 plus years, and I'm seeing it sort of live out in the communities of practice. I know that the Teaching and Learning Center here at Memorial has communities of practice that come together and talk about different problems of practice and brings faculty together around interesting topics and innovations. So we have the same thing. We have a community of practice on culturally relevant pedagogy at our university. We have a community of practice on assessment, holistic assessment, indigenized assessment. We have a community of practice on generative AI and digital pedagogy. So these communities of practice have come together to just build knowledge, because that's what a community of learning does. And along with that, communities of inquiry, where we're trying to really plant the seeds for CITL. We're trying to pull together a Center for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at our university. And the way to start that is, of course, asking people questions. So these reflective lenses have been quite powerful in my teaching. And of course, what's come out of all of this work are really these last two orientations that are a bit more recent. And the language is a bit more recent. So many of you have heard about humanizing pedagogies. Seems kind of a strange thing to being human and being teaching, and now we suddenly realize that we have to have humanizing pedagogies. Well, I think we teach humans, don't we? So humanizing pedagogies. For me, it began way back when with the seminal work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, who really gave us this notion, this important framework of culturally relevant pedagogy. And her argument was, if we don't honor the cultural capital and the identities of our students in our teaching, then our pedagogy isn't going to be relevant. She wrote an amazing, she's written lots, but she wrote an amazing book called Dream Keepers. If I encourage you to read it if you have a chance. And Dream Keepers is a book about, it was her research, and what she did was she asked, I think it was 9, so she interviewed 9 non-African American teachers who taught in predominantly African American schools. And the student success rate was through the roof. And she said, I want to know your magic. I want to know what you're doing to create such success rate with students, where students, similar students in other areas are absolutely falling through the cracks. And so she put together the best practices of culturally relevant educators. That was a really important turning point for me because, as I mentioned earlier, my cultural background, my cultural habitus, and who I was never part of my education. I had to park it at the door and do my education the way that it was taught to me. And there was nothing in the education that I received at that time, I've been around for a while, so it's been a while, at that time that reflected who I was or that I could see myself in it. And so fast forward to just last year, a really great book. I happen to be part of an online book club, and the book was called Designing to Care. And Singleton and Paris talk about the online space as a space for humanizing. And they talk about how important it is to create caring online environments. So what this all boils down to is this notion that we have an identity-centric curriculum. Let's think about that. An identity-centric curriculum. Our students are who we teach. We teach them through content, right? And so if that's the case, I think my students, when they leave my class or my teaching, should be as fully who they are and who they want to be and who they dream to be when they leave. So that's the magic question, right? That's the golden question. What's the goal of my teaching? What's the goal of education for me? And at the time, as I was exploring this question for myself, I happened to read Earth and Mind, a great book by David Orr. And in that book, he talks about the goal of education. And he says the primary goal of education is what he calls paideia. Paideia is the mastery of oneself as much as the mastery of content. So if that's the main goal of education, my goodness, why haven't we been doing humanizing pedagogy all these years? So this really helped sort of bring all of that together for me. And then, of course, in our final orientation, I draw heavily on the work of scholars such as Bell Hooks, who talks about the classroom as being the last space of radical possibilities. And of course, more recently, Kevin Gannon's work on radical hope. And if you haven't read his book, it's transformative. And so Kevin Gannon talks about creating these radical spaces of possibilities, and that the radical hope that we have to instill in our teaching and in our students is going to drive a different future for us, and hopefully a much more peaceful and loving and together future. And a big part of his work, which I really love, and I think it was referenced earlier, is this idea of fail forward, right? So take risks and use them as opportunities to learn. And you can't do that if you're not a reflective educator. So let's cultivate reflection, let's honor it, let's give people time to do it, let's embed it into the practice of their day-to-day living, and things will start to take care of themselves. I really believe that. Having been a person who's advocated for reflection for many years and has continued to do it on my own. So, as I mentioned, Gannon's call for radical hope is a call for more inclusive, ethical, and student-centered pedagogies. And so it's about transforming lives, right, through this kind of radical hope approach. So, thank you for getting me through that and staying with me. So thinking about these 6 orientations that were really important and transformative in my journey as an educator, I hope some of them resonated for you as well, and for those of you online. What if we consider all 6 of these orientations in reframing teaching as innovative teaching? What would and could post-secondary education look like? What are the possibilities? Oh, the suspense. Okay, so time to do some window notes. Okay, sure, we have time for one offering. If somebody would like to share something, who would like to share something that they wrote? Wait time. Okay, I would ask somebody online, but I can't hear them. All right, well, you may have a chance to share in a bit. So let's keep going. All right, so what? We've got these great orientations to guide our innovation. What are some innovations and what do they look like in my teaching? And what do they look like in other people's teaching around me? So one of the first things I want to just share with you is something that I wrote actually as part of my 3M National Teaching Nomination Package, and it was this notion of first touch. So I'm a soccer mom, grew up watching soccer, played a little bit in my early days, and my husband was a soccer player and soccer coach as well. Spent a lot of time on the side of a soccer field. And this notion of first touch, how many of you have played soccer? Right? You've heard this idea of first touch, right? It's who gets first touch with the ball is usually the person that ends up getting a goal and finding success. So, and I was thinking about this and I was thinking, well, it's the coach that's sort of guiding from the side. And we know that the coach analogy has been used a lot in teaching, but really it's about the students and how they work with the curriculum. So this notion of first touch made me think about who has first touch with the curriculum in my teaching. If it's only me ever, always, then my students aren't working with curriculum at all. It's me filtering through what I think they should know and just giving it to them. So this idea of first touch became a kind of a framework for me to put literally and figuratively the curriculum in the hands of my students. So I used to ask myself at the beginning of every lesson or every class, is there something that I don't need to tell them that they can work on and figure out themselves or get to some portion of that? And that's how I would reframe my lessons. So it became very active. So this notion of first touch sort of guided my teaching. I keep spaces in my syllabus. So how many of you do that? How many of you have an open space in your syllabus? Okay, so try it. So what I would do is I would have my list of topics and I'd have a space, and I have students every year say, what are we doing in week 12? What are we doing in week 8? I'm like, well, I don't know. It's your course. Let's figure it out together. Maybe you have some topics that you want to share with us. Maybe there's something that'll come up as a result of the learning that we do that we need to address. Let's fit it in there. Because this course has to be our course, not just mine. The choices for final assignments are huge. right? I think many people are recognizing that the only one way of assessing learning, as we heard from the previous comment, you know, grades are not the only way to assess learning, of course, and you're going to learn lots more about that with the next keynote. Ungrading, I came from a set of programs, teacher education programs, largely in BC, are ungraded. So for over 20 years, I've been working in ungrading, and I didn't know that's what it was called. But that's what it produced, was powerful learning, because the focus was not on getting the grade. The focus was on getting people to learn and grow and improve. So it was this cycle of, you know, create, provide feedback, learn from that feedback, apply that feedback, and do it again. And it was just this cycle of ongoing learning. Lots of collaborative structures in my classes. Students definitely teaching students. Lots of peer teaching. Reflection, of course, and then this notion of an identity-centric curriculum. So really making those personal connections for people to their own lived experience. How does this land for you? Where have you seen this? Do you have examples from your own experience that connect with what we're learning today? How would you take what we learned from this class and apply it to your context and in your community? Does this make any sense? Asking students if they've read scholars within their own cultural community that they would like to bring into the class or into the course. So really focusing on who are my students, getting to know them, and then being able to say that that's going to guide my teaching. So just some examples I wanted to share with you. This is an example of an assignment that I start off with right at the beginning, which is a student sort of information sheet. And I say, well, I really want to get to know you, not just your names. And, you know, obviously I do some work with names and where does your name come from? That too, but I actually want to know, how do you learn? What drives your learning? What are you passionate about? What learning have you done that you bring to this work? What's a learning style or preference that you have? And I do this with all of the students in the class, and then I do some data analysis on it. And it gives me great insights into who my students are. It's time well spent, absolutely well spent. So that's one example. This is just an example of a syllabus that I have. This is from an elementary methods of science course. So I taught elementary and secondary methods for years. And you can see that there's a blank space in class number 11. We don't know what we're doing that day. We'll figure it out as we go. And students are quite surprised at how their content, their perspectives are valued in the class. This is another one. Sorry, the font is very small here, but just wanted to share another example where I've given 4 different choices for an assignment. So they could do a portfolio, they could do a physical, this was again another science methods course. They could create a kit of science activities that we had done. I used science instructional models. I have about 8 or 9 of them now that I've sort of refined and put into practice. And so I say to them, just pick 1 or 2 of those science instructional models and put them in a kit and show me how you're going to use it and write up a lesson plan for it. So this was for secondary science teachers. Or they could come to me and say, this is what I want to do. Choice number 4 is your choice. So there's lots of choices here. And you can see that in this particular situation, because it's an ungraded course, there wasn't a final exam. There was an option for a paper. And again, a reflective paper. So again, some examples of how to embed some choice. Okay, so I'm very fortunate to be part of the 2022 cohort of National Teaching Fellows. And the 3M NTFs that I'm part of, we're really good friends. We have a WhatsApp group. It kind of goes a little bit crazy sometimes. And we share all kinds of ideas. And I wrote to them and I said, hey, friends, I'm doing this keynote. What's innovative teaching to you? You're like the top 10 professors in Canada. What's the most innovative teaching for you? And of course, WhatsApp blew up. And I had streams of responses, and I had emails coming in. And so I took a few of their quotes with their permission, of course. And so I asked them, what does innovation look like for you? And this was the response of one of my colleagues. Science is constantly evolving as a discipline, and so must we as educators. I seek to incorporate new developments in the field into my courses. Technological advancements change how material is delivered to students and change the competencies of students themselves. Wow. I have never taught the same course the same way twice. Me either. I want to inspire students to want to learn, and that's the key to excellence in teaching. To know something is to know how to do it. So this again comes back to, this happens to be a chemistry professor, this comes back to that idea of the nature of science being embedded in their pedagogical approaches. As educators, we can't do these things for the students. No, we can't. But we can give new tools for learning how. Cut the 10-page essay and leave options for photo, voice, stories, digital stories, etc. Students should build relationships through learning. For me, innovation is simple. It equals flexibility. Innovation is getting feedback from students and then pivoting my approach in teaching. Again, that idea of embedding those 4 lenses of knowing. One of them is from students. I must know myself and my students very well. My core values as an educator, how diverse my students are, and learning about their names in the first class to start relationship building. That wasn't me, that was from a colleague, microbiologist. Innovation is making the content relevant to teaching, to society today. I take risks every time I teach. This keeps innovation alive in my practice because I have to think on my feet and read the room. So I thought I would share some of those wonderful quotes from my wonderful colleagues who were so generous with their ideas. Now I want to share with you some video clips. So one of the things that we do at our Teaching and Learning Center is we have events twice a year called Celebrate Learning. And we invite faculty, and they're so generous with their time. We invite faculty to come and celebrate learning, and they do 10-minute videos or 8 to 10-minute video clips of things that they've done in their teaching. And so what I've put together is 4 2-minute clips. And I'll show you those in a sequence with a little bit of a break in between. But before we go to that, I just wanted to share with you some of the examples of what's available. And these are available on our website, so happy to share those with you afterwards. But what is innovative teaching? What does innovative teaching look like in a multiple array of disciplines? So we have some clips that show business organizational pedagogy. Remember when I talked about signature pedagogies? In practice. This professor and a few of her colleagues are doing business organization pedagogy in their classrooms. It's fabulous. Co-constructing the syllabus, where some people like the idea of having spaces in their syllabus and have actually co-constructed their syllabus with students at the upper level. This idea of first touch, which I've spoken about. For some of you who may not be familiar with the work of Dr. Peter Lildahl, who is a math educator in BC, based at Simon Fraser University, his work has been around thinking classrooms. And although it's K-12, it's become post-secondary. And NVPS stands for non-permanent vertical surfaces. And so in many of our math classrooms at our university, I'll often walk down the hallway, that's like my favorite thing to do, walk down the hallways of our buildings, and I'll see lots of students standing up on whiteboards working on problems in groups. And so this non-permanent vertical surfaces approach is this thinking classrooms approach. We have a fabulous piece, but I couldn't get a short enough clip from one of our professors who teaches in Indigenous Studies on how land-based learning has played out in her classroom. AI-infused arts education. We currently have a faculty member who is basically leading the way in terms of infusing AI into all of her art education classes. Historical replication, you'll see an example of that. Case studies, reflections on midterms. We have a kinesiology professor who is embedding reflection into each of the assessments that she's been doing. So after an assessment, she has the students reflect on what did they do to prepare for it, how did they feel after the assessment, did the assessment assess what they really knew and understood, were there parts on the assessment that didn't really fit with what they thought was going to be on it, and sort of does a little bit of an analysis of the assessment through their reflection. Again, feedback from students. And then, of course, ungrading is taking hold in lots of different ways in our university and other universities. So I'm going to show this video, and hopefully it works really smoothly. How are we doing? Good? Okay. So the first professor is a social work professor.
Still geared towards that part one of describing and then analyzing in part two. Okay, and so we see here different options that essentially students can pick that can, in a sense, make this assessment more authentic to them. And so we've discussed both of these options. I also developed a creative option number 2, allowing students to work in a small group to develop a board game, to write a children's book, to do a TED Talk, or even to create a lesson plan. These options emerged during the earlier part of the semester, where I discovered that students were kind of gearing their education towards teaching, to become teachers, social workers, nurses, or activists of sorts, right? So I wanted to create assessments that students could use, that could make their own, that would kind of align with some of their interests. Of course, these options had to align with the purpose of the assignment that I previously described. Here are some examples of some of their creative options. Creating a game of real life where students incorporated, intersectionality, gender as an aspect of social organization throughout this game to make it more real, to draw attention to barriers to, things like sexism and racism and ableism, etc. One student wrote a book on the standard North American family that challenged discursive assumptions about the family to move beyond binary understandings of gender and sexuality. Other students did a poem. Some students did lesson plans, some amazing TED Talks as well that kind of allowed students to apply knowledge within different sort of contexts and environments. And so some tricks of the trade. Beginning of week 2, 3, I started selling this final assessment. Even though I hadn't developed it yet, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to make something that was relevant, that was interesting, that allowed students choice. And so I started selling it, kind of, framing it as an ability to put knowledge into practice.
So that's just a little clip of
Very
a 10
focused on
minutes.
ourselves
This is Dr.
and our
Eric
own
Lee.
success, whereas
graphics.
Indigenous people practice humility and share the gift with the next generations. So this is some key finding when they watch the interview between me and Lorna. Now, bring all these findings, we move to the next stage, making. So this is it's the critique section, some evidence that class activities that we have in class. After some in-class discussions, people started to brainstorm the idea to find something they found meaningful. Also to analyze and examine the current design. Slowly to develop this visualization process, bringing things in a good structure and compositions, some computer iterations. I would say, I opened up this learning opportunity to my students. So some of them were very interested in Indigenous subjects. Some of them are interested in, for example, right here, environmental issues. And this is the outcome. And if you want to see this outcome, now we have this little exhibition at C building. We have this year-end show. So check it out. And then I want to show you some highlight, some interesting outcome by my student. So this is the work by Denise. So the theme of her work is to move on together with pride. So she, in her finding, she identified this person, Ayana Miracle. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. So she's an indigenous transgender person, also a multidisciplinary artist, scholar, educator, and story crafter.
Of banknotes.
So the first thing that was really important to me, especially talking about the issue of gun control, was really bringing indigenization to life. So sort of moving beyond acknowledgements and into really practicing indigenization and showing my students how that can happen. So I was very lucky with a little bit of money from my SHIRT grant. I was able to bring an Indigenous elder and knowledge keeper in from the local Stalo community to talk about traditional Indigenous hunting practices and hunting rights. Obviously, this is very relevant to the gun debate because as the government is trying to legislate firearms, they really have to be careful and aware to not infringe on Indigenous hunting rights and the very important role that hunting plays in these communities. So the students were able to learn about treaty hunting rights, not just from a textbook. Obviously, we did the readings beforehand, but they were to actually hear from real Indigenous elders and who had extensive experience hunting in the Fraser Valley. And they were able to connect their experience to theory. So for example, the knowledge keeper talked about ceremonies in the community like weddings and how as the hunter for the community, he would go and he would harvest meat and bring it to the celebration and everyone would be able to eat. And also, of course, about the sort of danger that as hunting becomes less and less common, the elder really lamented that people in the community are sourcing less of their meat from hunting and more from places like McDonald's, and talked about the health impacts that's having on the community. So the students had a fantastic time, and you could see they were engaged, they lit up, and they really were able to demonstrate to me that they could understand not just on an intellectual level, but really on an emotional and personal level, the role that hunting plays in local Indigenous communities. So this was a really valuable exercise. Something else I really wanted to do in this class was to create learning experiences. So we decided to do a simulation. Bill C-21 is the Liberal government's latest gun control regulation, and it's going through Parliament right now. I actually had the opportunity to go earlier in the semester and speak to the Senate in committee as they were studying this bill. So I wanted to bring that experience to life for my students and show them how legislation's made firsthand.
So he simulated the parliamentary debate in his class as part of the
magic.
history.
What I'm referring to is the ability to take a required 200 level course where some of students' initial reactions or expectations were along the lines of this, and this. And throughout the course of the semester, transforming them into this. So finding a way to bring out both the emotional and cognitive engagement with the material. The way that I did this is by drawing from what are called classroom as organization instructional methods. They have a relatively long history in business education, and they're grounded in foundational experiential learning principles, which I'm sure most of you are to some extent familiar with Kolb's model. In a nutshell, what it says is that adults learn best when they're able to engage in hands-on experimentation with course material, and then also critically reflect on and engage in reasoning about their learning. In the original classroom as organization methods, what instructors would do is take their entire course or their entire class and consider it to be a single organization. So they would assign students either the role of worker, middle manager, or leader. And often the instructor would take on the role of CEO. And then the students would work in this simulated organization throughout the entire semester, with the intention being giving students the ability to truly experience what it is like to work within an organization.
So some amazing examples, as you've seen, from our own university professors. And I hope that that kind of brought to life for you some of the orientations that I was talking about, and certainly some of the applications of innovation that are happening, I think, here at Memorial University as well, and all your campuses, and certainly at our university, at the University of the Fraser Valley. So to wrap up, I have provided links to the full lengths of these 4 videos, as well as other ones in my PowerPoint. I'm going to share that with all of you after this talk. But just to close off, our last opportunity to write our 4th window note. So please take a moment to take 30 seconds to write a window note. 30 seconds. I have 1 minute. Okay. I'm going to do the bad teacher thing and rush you. Off we go. So to close off, so putting innovation to practice means taking risks and failing forward, means teaching differently from class to class because your students are all different from class to class, means trying new pedagogical approaches and current trends in assessment, means fostering meaningful relationships in your teaching. Putting innovation in practice is what you need to do. Means reflecting on your teaching, collaborating and sitting down with colleagues to hash out problems of practice, means connecting with your Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning, with our teaching and learning centers, any teaching and learning center, and really bashing out those ideas with specialists who can provide discipline-specific structures for you. And obviously, it means that you need to be an educator. So back to the question, isn't all teaching inherently innovative? Of course it is. These orientations to teaching ensure that we can move our content and engage our students in powerful ways. It means that each student takes up the learning in different ways, and we don't need to look far. Innovation lives in you and in your students. Thank you. So we did these window notes. We were going to have a little bit of fun. I don't know if we have time. All right. So how many of you like making paper airplanes? I do. I grew up making them. I did. Or snowballs. So just to have some fun, if you'd like to, you can make a paper airplane out of your window notes, toss it somewhere into the aisles, and grab a different color and read what somebody else wrote. So we have time for questions, comments, reflections. I think a few minutes. Okay? We have a few minutes for comments, questions. Okay. So feel free to read something off of a window note that you happen to pick up, or a comment or question on your own. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. And I just wanted to say, I think you just reinforced everything I ever thought of innovation in teaching. And thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to comment on the table that you had with the different pedagogical styles, epistemological thinking, and I really like it, but my thoughts are that we don't have to put ourselves in one column. Hopefully we're more to the right, but we can have bits and pieces of ourselves in the different columns so that we're not one particular person, we're made up of all these different parts.
Absolutely. I so appreciate you saying that. Thank you. Just as our students are so complex, so are we. And I think of the and not the or. We can do it all. And there's a place for it all. And then there's
Go ahead. Yeah. Awneet, just that you challenged, I think, for me, one of the things I think we think about every day is about the classroom, the traditional classroom, and ways to reconfigure the classroom, the structure, versus seeing what's in the classroom, which are the students. It's not about the setting, more or less, it's about the people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you.
You could still have a traditional classroom.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I have nothing to talk about in education, but as journal, I have few points. Creativity, of course, is pathway to innovation. It has something to do with environment as well. So we have to provide a creative environment to think creatively. And also a very important point, ethics in creativity, which is a very, important point, we can say a concern nowadays related to, innovation. We create a lot of innovative products, application, but we may miss the ethics part into it. And also about positive personalities. So how you, being creative, it's all about how your personality is. So negative personality may lead to negative creativity and innovation, and the positive has the same effect.
Absolutely.
So just some important points.
Oh, such important
Thank you.
words. Thank you so much. I think about something you just said in terms of how we model our passion for our professions and our fields of disciplinary areas. And that positivity and that hopefulness that Gannon writes about in terms of radical hope, we have to be beacons of hope for our students at times too. And so that sense of hopefulness and positivity has to come from us. I often used to say that when I used to teach high school way back when I taught high school, I used to say that students can pick up your energy like lint, right? Like, I have yet to find happy students in an unhappy educator's classroom. So you're absolutely right. Yes?
Hi, thank you very much for that presentation. It's very, very inspiring. I teach mostly in engineering, and so I'm challenged by the notion of humanizing pedagogies. It's an interesting and eye-opening thing for me to think about. But you can imagine in engineering and probably most of the sciences, the students are expected to check their personalities at the door, and if they have them, and we deliver content is what we think of when we teach that way.
Yeah.
In those sorts of fields, how do you bring in the human side of that?
It's a $1 million question. And to your point about their personalities, I hope they find their personalities through your teaching, right? Because that's part of it, is finding out who you are through the teaching and through the experience. So the idea of humanizing looks different in different disciplines. But the core idea is that what they're learning, what content they're working with, the competencies they're building, as one of my colleagues said, is the building of competencies as well in that discipline, that those become part of human vision. So students say, okay, well, we're gonna innovate and learn about these, through design thinking, we're gonna create this technology. What's it for? Who is it going to help? Why are we creating it? Is there a reason for this? Have we assessed the need for it? So we bring the human element into the work that we do. So it's not necessarily that you have to have everyone sitting down doing identity bags, which is something I also do, an activity, but you are going to embed the human question into the work around why we're doing this and who is this serving, who is it not, who hasn't it served historically. And can we engineer something to right that wrong? So it's about centering the human experience in the work. That's the best I can do with that. Yes?
I just want to follow up on that comment. My background is in teaching creative writing, teaching poetry. I taught for about 4 or 5 years in the English department. And some of the best and most innovative and interesting students I had were engineers. So I think one of the ways to break down some of those concerns about humanizing certain varieties of curricula is to break down those silos as well and work sort of cross-disciplinarily. So if anybody's looking for a poet in residence, I'm open to discussion.
Wonderful. Great idea, yes, right? Those silos that we're trying to work against. Great paradox of universities. Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate all of your involvement and for this time, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. Thanks to those online.